like to honor people's time, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Esther McBay. I'm one of the regional superintendents here at Portland Public Schools, and I want to seize this opportunity to once again welcome you to the Southeast Guiding Coalition meeting. This is our seventh session in the series of meetings scheduled to provide grassroots input to the decision-making process for Southeast Guiding Coalition regarding our schools and our programs. As we stated earlier, this is a multi-tiered process that will enable us to focus on phase one, and the goal for phase one is to create a boundary for Kellogg Middle School, which is scheduled to open next year, fall of 2021. And we also need to, in that phase, to consider converting Harrison Park from a K-8 to a 6-8 middle school. I do want, on behalf of the district, to express our gratitude for your continued participation and commitment to the process. Your input is invaluable to us. It helps us shape future meetings as we strive to meet the needs of our communities while also centering our students. We are hoping that phase one will culminate in December with a decision to the superintendent on how we want to move forward with our schools, our boundaries, and our programs that are factored in this phase. Phase two will take place in the spring. Last week, we streamlined our focus a little better to center our attention around the phase one goals. Tonight, we will revisit our scenarios and also look at some new scenarios that were generated from our meeting last week. The goal is to determine feeder patterns for Kellogg Middle School and to hopefully place the GLI program as you see fit in this scenario. At the end of the session this evening, you will have the opportunity to complete the evaluation form and give us feedback. We all may not get what we want, but I am certain we can, by centering our students using the RESJ lens, arrive at decisions that put our students first. Again, thank you for partnering with us in this work, and welcome. Slide 2. Our meeting objectives tonight are, we do want Guiding Coalition, we will be providing feedback and direction online and through phone surveys. We will review and refine phase one scenarios to date, and we will narrow and improve scenarios based on consensus decision-making processes. Next slide. We do have group agreements that we adhere to. This is to enable us to hear as many voices as possible and to, as much as possible, allow our families of color to see themselves as a very important part of this process. We would like you to please stay engaged emotionally, physically, and mentally or intellectually. We want you to please seize this opportunity to speak your truth responsibly. We would like you to seek to understand and to just trust the process. I know that there are times that we feel that we don't necessarily hear what we were hoping to hear, and people get a little bit discouraged. Trust the process. I am very certain it will work out in our best interest in the long run. Be willing to do things a little bit differently and experience discomfort. Anytime there are decisions to be made in an environment such as this, there will be many opportunities to experience discomfort. And part of being able to arrive at a great decision is to experience that discomfort and still be able to come out with a decision that centers our students. Expect and accept non-closure. Next slide, please. The agenda for tonight is at 6 o'clock, which is what we're doing right now. Talk about the objectives and the agenda. Then the second thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the centering whiteness. Our goal is to make sure that we continue to promote our RESJ lens. We'll talk about our community engagement updates. We'll also review team scenarios from the last meeting, which was held on the 22nd of October. We'll have opportunities to work in our breakout sessions, and then we'll listen to flow analytics as they report out to the team. At 8:30, we hope to adjourn this meeting. Next slide. That said, we're going to begin by looking at decentering whiteness. So sometimes,
Serge Shanice has joined us. Thank you.
Oh, perfect.
Hi, greetings, everyone.
I would like to yield the floor to Shanice Clark. Thanks, Shanice. Welcome.
Welcome. Thanks, folks, are giving me grace as I'm doing the meeting shuffle. So I know a couple of weeks ago we kind of introduced this to you all, and we took a look at Tema Akun's characteristics of decentering whiteness and kind of reflected on our process, especially in ways that we can make iterative adaptations and shifts to how things move forward, how work complements with other community engagement, and so on. And so I know also we sent out via email a feedback link, and so I'm really curious about hearing the feedback from you all on ways we can think about these process characteristics. And I'm seeing some folks have already gave us some feedback that is very meaningful, that we want to be able to reflect on and present back to you all in ways that might help us, really help us moving forward. So I'm going to reflect on this, but ultimately it's the same people that you've seen before. And really we wanted to provide a space to make sure we're circling back to some of these characteristics and the ways that they might be showing up, in addition to making tweaks to the table, taking the input and expertise from folks in the Southeast Guiding Coalition to make meaningful adaptations in our scenario development, in our work as a coalition, in our engagement. And so what you're looking at will be something we hope to adapt with your feedback and reflect on some of these norms. And so I'll share the sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality. I think as we are feeling the pressure of being in a pandemic and opening learning communities, Kellogg Middle School and a comprehensive middle school, among other goals we have in our process, presents real challenges that really reflect some of these characteristics we also want to mitigate. And so your expertise on how to do this well is appreciated. We can move to the next slide. I think the only one way right, either or thinking, right to comfort, worship of the written word. There's some thoughts on the right-hand column of strategies we want to continue in our work. But I'm hearing there are more we can add through that feedback form. And so maybe one of the folks from our mighty team can help me out here and throw a link in the chat. This is ultimately already went out to the Southeast Guiding Coalition members. But just as a refresher for you all to use the link, and we'll be able to continue to have discussion as a group on what other norms we can be adding. But I think this phone survey and online survey is one key example of how other ways of thinking, priorities of our communities, we want to orient and center in our decision making and perspectives moving forward, and ultimately focus groups as well. So had a really great space today, and I'm excited about what opportunities and learnings we'll continue to have ultimately that can have counter narratives and counter perspectives to what we might be sitting and sifting through here. Next slide, please. And so the other characteristics remaining here: paternalism, perfectionism, power hoarding, and fear of open conflict are other characteristics we invite folks to continue thinking about, in addition to how our renorming practices might be able to mitigate those. Creating space for folks to influence the process, to make changes and adapt, to create spaces for both Black, Indigenous, multilingual speaking communities, in addition to students having weigh-in in our community engagement processes, and creating more spaces for discussion. I think are ways that we can continue to build and mold to reflect on our practices, but without the leadership and perspective of you all, it's hard for us as a district to know all the steps that we need to take. And so I think your perspectives, especially if you have some to offer on mitigating these characteristics of whiteness present in our process, I'm inviting you to sit with that and share it as we continue tonight in our groups, but especially in that feedback form as we're going to basically adapt what we're hearing from y'all and apply it. So appreciate y'all for letting me revisit this table, as I think that it's racial equity work in its nature is a continuous muscle that we all ought to be continuing to build in this process and in our work. And so I think we can move on to the next slide.
Great. Well, thank you, Shanice, for that wonderful review. All of us are anxious to continue practicing using the racial equity, social justice lens in our work tonight. Just want to thank the coalition members again for being here again tonight and representing your community on this very important project that we have in front of us. I think one thing that we've heard from coalition members over the first few meetings is there's a little bit of reticence at times to say, hey, this is what my community thinks, and this is how I'm going to position myself as a coalition member in these meetings. And so in hearing that, we've been working to get information from the community a couple of different ways. One is through the online survey that each of you can refer to in the packet. It's about a 8-page summary of those results. This slide just shows from the respondents, and there are around 500 respondents to that survey. It shows the racial ethnic makeup of the respondents, and so you can see that visually on this slide, and then also get more information about the questions, about the responses, and about further breakdown of the demographics of those responders. And so I would just push you towards that Dropbox. You can also see it if you're watching via the YouTube channel. You can see this summary also on the Portland Public Schools webpage in the enrollment and balancing link there. So this is one way that as coalition members you can get some information about what the constituents in your communities think and use that moving forward. Now the other way is through a phone survey that has been conducted by Critical Data, and I'd like to introduce at this time Bill Hockett from Critical Data, who will talk about these targeted phone survey and the results, the preliminary results so far that they have received. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Kent. I apologize for the lighting. I'm in a room that does not have optimal lighting. From October 1st to October 25th, which was just a couple of days ago, Critical Data completed one-on-one telephone interviews specifically with parents and guardians of middle school aged children, representing the 12 middle schools within this portion of the district. We completed the surveys in a statistically accurate relevancy based upon the population of each of the schools. We completed a total of 335 interviews, and the goal with these interviews was to complete as many of the interviews as possible with the BIPOC parents and guardians. And we were provided a list that identified those families from Flow Analytics. And our goal was to complete as many of those interviews as we could. And I'm happy to say that of the 335 interviews that were completed, 226 were completed with Black, Indigenous, or people of color parents and guardians. So that's 67% of the 335 interviews. These interviews lasted an average of 18 minutes each, so people were very thoughtful in the conversations they had with us. What you have in front of you and what you've received today from Jed and Flo is a short summary of the overall findings. Next week you'll receive the full report, and I can't tell you how strongly I would urge you to go through that full report and read the verbatim comments of the parents and the guardians, because that's really where you'll see their heart. That's really where you'll see exactly how they feel. We capture all of the verbatim comments, and so it's a long report, but it's time very well worth spending. We've broken this survey out both by program and by race ethnic group. And so on each of the questions, you'll be able to see the findings from each of the groups. I would I would go to page 4 if you could, please. We asked several questions, as you might remember, in your team's help in constructing the survey, relative to awareness of the district forming a guide coalition committee, awareness of the fact that the district had growth and program balancing challenges, and then finally an awareness question that was relative to the Portland Public School vision and how aware they were of it. And in each of these areas, the awareness level is quite low. It varies by race a bit, and it varies by program a bit, but you can see that the highest awareness is still very, very low. And it's an area where I'm sure that you're looking at increasing the awareness to those parents and guardians in a number of different ways. And that would be real important. If you go to the next page, please. We provided parents and guardians with a list of 7 different attributes, and we asked those parents and guardians to grade each attribute in terms of its overall importance to them regarding their child's school. The 2 that were rated most important were the importance of a small class size. That's a 3.42. And the importance to remain on the same middle school or high school path that they're currently on. Those were the 2 of the 7 attributes most important. Of those 7 attributes, the ones that were viewed least important were eliminating most, if not all, portable classrooms. That's a 2.03. And attending the same school as neighbors or as friends, 2.52. And again, you'll be able to see each of these broken out in a number of different ways. And I know that I don't have the time to go through each of the questions with you. I wish I did. I've offered to Jed that if there's a team that would like us to go through the full report and provide our analysis of this information compare it, we've done this work for school districts across the country for years, and compare those findings in different areas, we're more than happy to do so. So if there's ever a time that we can help go through this report, we're happy to do that. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. And we know that we'll get the full summary probably during the week for our next meeting. This time I'd like to turn over to Danny, and she's going to talk a little bit about the first breakout that we have for your teams to review this data in both the regular online surveys and also this initial phone survey data. Welcome, Danny.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. I just want to reiterate all the thanks to everyone for continuing to engage in this process, to sort of stay in group agreement, and for all of your commitment to really sort of thinking about how this process relates to our work around racial equity and social justice, how we can really lean into our values and our commitment in all of our decisions. So we've heard you talk about the importance of engaging communities. What we want to do right now is have some time for some reflection in your small groups to talk about the importance of what we're hearing and the impact of the decision and relate it to some of the information that we're hearing. As you've heard Shanice, as you've heard other folks talk about some of the stakeholder engagement that's occurred, and then some of the information that we're getting back from these online and phone surveys. So the racial equity and social justice lens, we had a session where we focused on that lens, and I want to come back to it, and we're going to focus on two critical questions to help this group really get to some shared analysis and to bring some questions out. The lens itself is a decision support tool, right? The lens isn't going to give us the answer, but hopefully it will provoke robust conversation so that we can arrive as a collective at some shared understandings and some shared rationale for our decision making as we move forward. So one of the key questions in the lens, it's question number 2, is who are the stakeholders that have been involved and how are they impacted? So one of the things that we want to encourage everyone to do in your first breakout is to go ahead and sort of start thinking about, when we're talking about enrollment and program balancing, who are the key stakeholders and members and community members who are impacted by these decisions that are going to be made in the process. And then based on your review and your discussion of the online survey and the phone survey, we'd like you to start seeing where you might see some opposition or some support to some of the decisions moving forward. And I think that this is one where we want to also ask each of you to think about the perspectives that you bring, some of the additional work that I know that a lot of you have done in sort of talking with community members, talking with similar parents, talking with your school communities about some of these decisions, and really try to bring those voices in. I think the value of this coalition is that we all have such a different lived experience, and we have different experiences that we can bring to this process, in addition to some other of this quantitative information that we have here. So we're going to go ahead and put you into breakout groups, and then we'll hope that you'll take the couple of moments just to talk about and really do like a specific list, and then to cross-apply that list with what you're hearing and answer that question about stakeholder support and why. So I think that's going to take us there.
I will. I'm just going to do a quick time check here. Let's see if we give that about. Yeah, let's give this a 10-minute breakout room session, and I'm going to go ahead and open those rooms right now.
Hope we had a good discussion. Looks like we got 60 folks back. I think we had 61 when we left, so we'll have to determine where that one person went. But I think we got most folks back. We're going to move into the next portion of our work tonight, and that is to kind of discuss some feeder patterns and give you, again, some more time to work on winnowing down some potential scenarios that we'll have to even focus down some more to look at what will be brought forward to the community in a couple of weeks. We definitely had a conversation with the advisory team over the scenarios that were produced last week. It was a little difficult at times to determine what scenario might be attached to the comment from the group. And so, Jed, if you want to put the next slide up. And so as we looked at the feeder patterns, remember we refocused our focus, I guess, on looking at the feeder patterns last week. And so the scenarios that were developed really were around these tenets that were really asked of last week. And so scenarios bringing forward today are around those feeder patterns that you will look at. I think we have about 8 scenarios to show, and then we're going to ask you to work on some DLI placement on those scenarios. And so we looked at, does the scenario really make a feeder for Kellogg? Because that is our top priority in terms of creating that feeder for Kellogg. And then also, along with that, is creating that feeder for Harrison Park, which would open the next year as a middle school. And so does each scenario put it over capacity? Does it not? And so that was really what we looked at from the advisory team to get these scenarios in front of you tonight. And so I'm going to let Jed talk about each scenario moving forward. And then Danny will talk a little bit about the lens that we need to look at before we get into our larger breakout time on our groups, which is to take a look at the DLI on these scenarios. So take it on.
Thank you, Kent. Yeah, so I just want to run through a couple highlights on this slide here really quickly. So we were able to evaluate feeder patterns from most of the teams. We based that on a couple set of criteria. First of all, we were just looking for any scenarios that were replicating basically the same kinds of results for Kellogg and Harrison Park. And we were also looking for any that put one of those middle schools over capacity. We didn't see that in any of these cases. But I just wanted to let folks know that it's really important that the worksheets for the maps include complete scenarios. And I'll talk a bit and set it up more for us tonight as we get into our work that really starts to identify the feeder patterns that are sort of the preferred of your work group, and to then start doing some dual language immersion and focus program placement. I did see a lot of notes along those lines. Again, we recognize that it's really difficult to draw a bright line between the neighborhood programs and the dual language immersion programs. But the results that we want to show this week are really focusing in on how those neighborhood programs would populate those middle grade schools. And so that's what I'm going to highlight a few slides for you that show that. On Dropbox and available to your facilitator, there is an abridged version of this slide deck that includes just the breakouts for each of the feeder paths that we looked at. So you'll see notes there as well as far as which team they came from, and if a particular feeder path wasn't evaluated further because it was, again, replicating. I think that was the main situation that we saw. It wasn't doing anything to change capacities or patterns at Kellogg or Harrison Park. It was already replicated in some other feeder path. Although we did show what that looked like with the graphics that show the feeder path. So let me just jump into this really quickly. And this is just a review. I want to remind you that this is available for you from last week. This again is that focus in on the middle grade enrollment and the current enrollment at the K-8s, as well as the available capacity with the middle schools that we were looking at. And then that same information for the forecasted enrollment. This is also a review, just the free meals rate that you'll see in some of the slides for the feeder paths as we look at those different scenarios. Race, ethnicity, we also have this for each of the feeder paths that we looked at this week. This is a new slide. I wanted to highlight this for the coalition because it becomes important for us to take a look at the high school grades just to make sure that the feeder paths, particularly for the neighborhood programs, are not going to put us in a situation where we're overloading, particularly Franklin. That's the one that we see currently is already over capacity and is forecasted to be more so. So that is included with each of the feeder paths that we looked at. And this is the forecast for those three high schools as well. And you can see again, Franklin is forecasted to go above, even more above capacity. So I'm just going to show you one example here, just to get you into your groups as quickly as possible here. So this is an oldie but a goodie. This is the feeder path that multiple teams have been working off, starting back with the springboard proposal and building some feeder paths off that. After which, we took a pause and said, hey, let's just make sure that we're reviewing the feeder paths before we get too wound around the axle on the complications of focus, options, and dual language immersions. So I did want to just map this out for you. Pay attention to the notes. It does say that, for instance, Sunnyside, and this is within the Cleveland cluster. It just isn't shown on here. Not really room for it. And note that Creative Science and Richmond, they are not neighborhood schools, so that's the reason that they're not shown on here. And they're not going to figure into the counts for the neighborhood programs. So for feeder one, this is the kind of information that you're going to be looking at for each of the patterns. So this is just that estimated neighborhood enrollment. And then you can see with the kind of that white box with the black border, that's the existing neighborhood enrollment. So obviously there with Kellogg, we don't have anybody in that school yet. So in this feeder pattern, the estimated enrollment would be 516 students that are in that neighborhood program. And then you'll also see there that I've plotted the functional capacity, which is that black bar above. And here's the free meals rate for this particular pattern. Not a lot of change here, except that, of course, we're populating Kellogg for the first time with mostly those K-8 conversions. So you're seeing a free meals rate register for the first time here with that. A little bit of change with Harrison Park, but that's really the only one that we're seeing much change in this situation. And just two more here quickly. Here's race ethnicity. This is just an update. Again, just need to highlight that this is for the neighborhood program only. And finally, here's that impact at the high school level for those feeder paths. So at this point, I think we're just going to talk a little bit of the nuts and bolts here for your work group over the next hour or so. So I'll set this up, Kent. What I've done is put together a pre-populated spreadsheet that your note taker, your facilitator, can go ahead and click through. So the first point of discussion here is really around what's that baseline feeder pattern that you want to start from. And I realize that you got a lot of information not too long ago, so you're probably going to want to spend a fair amount of time just looking through those graphs for each of the feeder paths. So please do that, spend the time that you need. Hopefully it's made relatively easy to be able to pick through the focus and DLI programs and where you want to place those, which would be the next step. You see the column there for focus DLI programs. You will find all of the programs. There's 18 of them that are broken out into different grade groups. And then you'll be able to place that program at one of the schools. And we need to make sure that each one of them has a home, even if it's at the school that it exists at right now. We want to make sure to document that. Kent, is there anything you wanted to add before we push it over to
No, I think just a little bit about process. As you get with your teams, what you're going to want to do probably is let folks take a little bit of time to review each of those 8 scenarios. A couple of the scenarios may have been ones that your group put forward, and so you might want to work right away on those. Certainly, the task is not to try to create and place DLI programs for every one of the 8 scenarios that are offered tonight, but instead work with your group to determine which 1 or 2 that your group thinks have some legs based on what you've heard over our time together over these last couple of months and the stats from previous scenarios and that you want to work on, and then have this discussion about DLI. So we are asking for a full feeder scenario tonight for your groups to at least say, hey, these are the 2 that we worked on, these are the ones that we're putting forward, and these are the ones that we'll report out on as taking the focus of our time tonight. What I want to do, though, is I also want us to remember what Danny's been presenting. And so I'm going to pass this over to Danny to just remind us again of the lens that we should be looking for and looking through in order to do this work and come up so that your group really feel have some legs and you want to report out about tonight.
Hi, everyone. So back to another question in the RESJ lens. One of the things that we want to try to do as we get closer to making decisions or trying to get to closer to coalescing around a certain scenario, one thing that can be helpful is to go back to these RESJ lens questions and reflect on them as a group. So as you look through, how does the scenario expand opportunities for racial equity and social justice is the question, right? Who are the demographic groups that will be affected? And then for each of the group that will be affected, how will they be impacted by the scenario? Are there potential unintended consequences, and are there strategies in place to mitigate any negative impacts? And I realize that you are taking in a lot of information, and I think one of the things that we're asking you to lean into is for the information that we have for where we are right now, how can we start to really start to codify how we're reflecting on our decision making through this lens by answering each of these prompts, and to really sort of like go into the prompts, because I think in doing that it'll help people really understand what some of those trade-offs may be, what some of those there's potential for unintended consequences, and if there are ways to mitigate, or if there may not be any on the table now. So we really want to have folks kind of take in all of your good work to date and really channel it in and ask folks to be with as much rigor as possible to take your feedback and your input and channel it into answering these questions. Because again, if we kind of build that muscle collectively, then we'll be able to really think about how this racial equity lens impacts the decision making. So you'll have an hour. I know that the last section, we're basically asking you to synthesize information right now. So you're taking what you know from the surveys, what you know from your own experience, from the experiences in your school communities, sort of taking back that feedback, thinking about refining the scenarios, and then reflectively taking this lens question and thinking about what the impacts are. And if this is where you land really is expansive of opportunity for racial equity and social justice. So we're going to break you out. You're going to have an hour to hopefully get into some robust discussions. I'd encourage folks to take some time to review, follow the directions around sort of the different feeder patterns that you heard from Kent, and then reflect on these questions as you move on.
So before we go, there's a few questions in the chat that were clarifying questions. And so one of them I want to, especially about the timing of materials tonight, we had a few people unexpectedly out this week. And so it was very difficult for us to complete all the work. there was also a lot of scenarios. Jed has prepared 8 of them for you tonight, trying to take into account all the scenarios that were brought back from last week. So I do appreciate the request for wanting additional time. And so when we come back, we'll discuss what we can do, because what will happen is if we go too long, then we won't have time again to get it back to you before the next meeting. But we'll see what we can do to add additional time for you guys to work on the scenarios. Now, Jed, I don't know if there were a few clarifying questions about what areas are to be working on. I believe we have a slide that talks about, we're looking at the 2 middle schools in the scenarios tonight. That's the focus, but I don't know if you want to give some words of wisdom about the scenarios that you created for them tonight.
Right. So, I think the thing to focus on is really just to determine if the neighborhood programs are representing, well, I think obviously we want to be considering the slide that you have in front of us right now. So pay special attention to free meals, rate, and the race, ethnicity that you're seeing with these different feeder patterns, right? And so there are really a couple of big moves, right, of having Mount Tabor feed up to Madison. That's one that's quite a bit different from some of the others, so I would ask you to hone in on those, as well as at least one scenario where Preston is now with Hosford feeder pattern, and therefore Cleveland. So just make use of those visuals, flip through those to see the feeder paths, and then reference back to how those fill up the schools with just neighborhood kids, and therefore how they, and also their demographics. Then we would ask you to identify where the DLI programs would go on top of that. And we just hope that you can get as far as you can get tonight. Like Claire said, you didn't have too much time to digest the neighborhood slice of this itself. So please just want to give you as much time as possible to consider those neighborhood programs.
And again, if I could just clarify, we're asking you to do that for all 8 scenarios. So we're asking your group to determine which scenarios you would like to do this work on. So there may be 2 or 3 scenarios, or even 4 or 5 that your group says it's not going to work because of X, Y, Z. So we're not going to spend our time there. Another group might. And it might be one of the scenarios that we look at next week because another group brought it forward. Your group really is to winnow down first part of your meeting, which 1 or 2 of these scenarios do you want to take further and do the full DLI push on it because you think they have some legs. So that's the task to help clarify. You're not doing all 8. Your group's determining which ones you want to do and the ones that you think have legs moving forward.
So Jed, there are a couple other questions. What scenarios have revisions since last week? And I would say, did you bring 8 new scenarios, or are these revisions from last week?
So some of them are just the same attendance areas regrouped into different feeders. So the same attendance areas that we've been looking at since the springboard. A couple of them did have some changes to attendance areas, which are on the Guiding Coalition webpage. You'll see that there are 3 of those, the web map. You'll see that those are 3 of those that are labeled feeder. And they are a bit different from those existing attendance areas. And so that's how those feeder patterns were built. So I believe those are feeder patterns 3, 4, and 9. The rest are building blocks from more or less existing attendance areas.
So another question is where they can see the number of students in DLI programs so they can identify where there's room for them in middle schools.
Right, so that's the first slide in the deck will show the breakout between existing enrollment of neighborhood and DLI in our middle grades. So you'll be able to see that there. And one thing just another little tidbit here is if you're unable to fit all the neighborhood students and the DLI program that you want to place in that school, just make a note of that it needs to have either a shrunken attendance area to accommodate, or that there can only be a certain number of strands of that program. That way we can make an accommodation there. So.
Another question, are there any scenarios that don't have split feeder patterns?
All of the neighborhood program feeder patterns that folks will see tonight, they do not have split feeder patterns except for the existing split feeder pattern with Lane Middle School, where Whitman goes on to Cleveland and the other two schools go on to Franklin. That's the only split feeder.
So the does scenario 3 assume Lent remains K8?
It assumes that Lent is a K5 all immersion, I believe.
Okay.
It is not a K.
And then I'm going to ask you to, Jed, at some point, Beth has very specific information about Mount Tabor that we can respond to after we get them into their rooms.
Sounds good.
Here, I don't mean to interrupt. This is Sabrina. Can I ask a quick thing?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I had put on here for my question, what about schools that, like, I'll just use Vestal as a specific example. Vestal kids right now go to Roseway Heights, and with this scenario, you know, Roseway Heights isn't included in that at all. So are we to assume that some of these schools they used to go to Northeast middle schools are not anymore? Or I just don't know how to think about that one.
Yes, for Vestal, it participates in feeders to either Mount Tabor or Harrison Park, I believe, in all the feeder paths that we looked at there. So no longer feeding to Roseway Heights.
Is that a decision?
It's a possibility.
Okay.
We're still working in an iterative scenario process.
Right, but there aren't the current situation isn't even one of the options.
Okay, I appreciate your question.
So did we, and I think we can follow up on that one. I think I'll try and pop into your room so we can talk about it. Any other questions before we launch, folks?
I think it's time to go is what I'm seeing from people.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, this is going to be 60 minutes. And
I'd like the map linked in the chart, please.
Okay.
I mean in the chat, sorry.
I'll have to visit each room to do that. Your facilitator should have that. But I won't visit each room. Okay, here we go.
Everyone. Sounds like there was some good discussion. I want to take just a minute to kind of recap a little bit about some discussions that we have had as a flow team with district staff, and that is that, you know, in this virtual world that we're trying to have these conversations, it's difficult. I think all of you are experiencing that and are realizing that. Things just take a lot longer in this world than they do when you're face to face and sit in a group of, 8 to 10 people around a table looking at the same data and being able to see others' body language, being able to kind of read people's intent. Right now, it's just hard, and so we have realized that these processes take a little longer in this type of mode that we're in right now. And so before we report out, I just wanted to share that we've already decided to take a little of that anxiety off of you, and we're going to be readjusting our schedule a little bit moving forward, probably moving the open house back even another week to mid-November, so that you have enough time in your teams to have the conversations you need to be able to feel good about the work that you're doing. So just want to share that. We'll have more specifics to that, and after we do our report out, we can share a little bit more about that as well. But want to take that kind of, I guess, off the table. If folks feel they need more time, we feel you do too, and we want to be able to provide that so that you feel productive in your groups and confident that you're moving the work forward. So as we report out, I would just ask each facilitator, and if you've determined someone other than the facilitator to talk from your group, that's great too. But just give us a general report out, kind of a share what your discussion was. If your group was able to come around maybe one of the scenarios and realize that you want to put your work and effort into that. And so we'll just go around the table and we'll ask that. And then also let us know what you need either tonight or through the chat or through the avenues that you have as to what data do you need to be able to help you do this work and move forward with it. We're really looking at giving the next meeting, giving you basically the whole meeting as a group to really work on your scenario or scenarios so that you can feel confident that you've turned something into us that we can get a good model back for you on the subsequent meeting, which would be the 12th of November. So we are going to meet next week, but we're going to give you that time to really continue this discussion and work. So let's go ahead and report out. We'll kind of hear where folks are, and others can hear where you are, and we'll finish our meeting this way. So Team Duke, I think tonight we have Keely as the facilitator. So Keely.
Hi, our group focused on Feeder Path 7 most of the time, and Lisa and Regina are going to share out for our group.
Hi there. I'm going to start, and Regina's going to correct what I say. So we focused mostly on Feeder Pattern 7. I'm a parent, and I'm a first grader, so I'm really learning, and I'm struggling with all this information, how and the language and the lingo. So my focus has been that if with Feeder Pattern 7, putting Spanish, maybe Lent, full school there. Oh, thank you. Making that this Spanish DLI, and then also Bridger, because there seems to be, we found the heat map for the area, and those are the two main areas of Spanish. So making those the Spanish school. We discussed about possibly the idea of moving the Harrison Park K-5 Chinese to Vestal, or maybe if we needed to move Vietnamese there too, that was also another possibility. And then Regina, I'm going to hand it off to you because I'm going to mess it up from here.
Marilyn Lisa. I'd say I'll go back to the rationale of why feeder path 7. We also looked at Lane being a split feeder and considered like valuing really having two schools, like two elementary schools feeding in, so there's more of a balance between students feeding into Lane and then feeding into different high schools. So that was another consideration of why we looked at this specific feeder path. The other reason, I guess, or motivator was Mount Tabor feeding into Madison, and then conversely, that would mean Harrison Park would then feed into Franklin. And so those feeder patterns, rationale for Mount Tabor being it's geographically closer to Madison, and we also talked about part of that conversation, of course, was also the DLI pathways. And as you can see, our group did not, ran out of time. We did not complete the exercise in mapping out where all the DLI programs would go, and focus option programs.
Great, thank you very much. And we definitely want the narrative behind the path that you've decided to focus on. And so we appreciate hearing that. If there's a way that you could also write that, that'd be great as well, so we could provide some summaries for everybody else as we move forward. Next group tonight, Team Flavel, Kathleen.
Hi there. We had one of our parents was going to present. Sarah, were you going to do it this time? And we were looking at scenario number 5.
No, thank you. I really don't have a good enough grasp of where we were working on.
That's right. Yeah, we also felt very rushed. Andy or Dee, did you want to present?
Or Melissa could if she has that, but I'm sure Dee and I are happy to if you'd like the parent perspective.
Great. That'd be great. Thank you.
So I don't know if we can pull out. So we worked from scenario 5, which I think the main change from the springboard there originally with the feeder pattern was shifting Creston to Hosford and to Cleveland. And we're interested once we actually have some numbers. Like part of the rationale for that was just trying to get Kellogg's utilization down a little bit from I think the upper 80s. But since we didn't have, we're curious to see what that actually looks like when it's fully modeled out with all the DLI program shifts. The other thing we explored in place in the DLI programs was, and again, this is just to have it as a scenario, was trying to create as many whole school K-5 DLI schools as we could. So we kind of went back to one of the options from several weeks ago, I think scenario 1, where we consolidated the Spanish DLI programs at Lent. In our scenario, we would have the K-5 Chinese DLI consolidated at the Clark building, which is where Creative Science is located currently. And then we just got into a preliminary discussion about possible, the assumption would be that Creative Science would need to then find a different building. And I think we floated some possibilities, but I don't know if we decided on one for sure. What am I missing, Dee? I think the middle high school feeder patterns, we didn't have any big changes in that one. So that still has, that has Harrison Park feeding up to Madison, and Mount Tabor feeding to Franklin still. Although I'll be interested to see some of these alternate feeder patterns modeled too. But what else would you add, Dee, on sort of the rationale stuff?
We opted not to really worry about Richmond's, just because we feel like they're not in our cluster. So we just felt like having to place them was more than we could handle in the time that we had. But I think from a number standpoint, it seemed like it worked. And I don't know if you mentioned this, but we floated the idea of CSS at Vestal. It just seems like locationally, it's kind of sort of like northeast but southeast. So it's a challenging location for enrollment in general, and that seemed like maybe that was an okay solution.
And then our scenario would also assume some boundary changes, which we didn't even get close to being able to map out. But you'd then have an opportunity to kind of combine some of what was in the springboard with potentially some boundary changes for Atkinson to balance out Bridger and Atkinson and to account for the Harrison Park K-5.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, you'll have that time next week. Next group, Team Foster, and I believe Alyssa is facilitating that group.
Hi, yeah. We spent our time talking about scenario 3, and I was a bad facilitator, did not leave time for us to have figure out who's going to speak. So if one of our parents is interested in speaking, I will put up what we talked about. So, is there anyone interested in speaking from our group?
I can speak from. It's weird. My camera's broken, so I'd rather pass.
I can try. We, at the end of the conversation, I kind of remarked I'm not even sure how we ended up on Feeder Path 3, but that's where we put our attention, and I think that by the end we kind of just decided that we could rule out Feeder Path 3. It's really complicated. That without having really the visual to see, like the numbers moving and how it's getting near overcapacity, it's really challenging to do this work. And whether if you're making assumptions about creating all DLI schools, like we just didn't feel ready to go there either. And so that's another thing. So it's, I think it's an interesting idea to try and figure out where the neighborhood schools are and then see where the capacity is to fit these programs, but I also feel like it's really hard to do this work when we haven't decided on some basic, concepts of like, are we consolidating all of Spanish DLI into one location, or is 4 strands of Spanish DLI feeding into a single middle school? Is that too much? Does it make sense to split up 2 and 2? So it just kind of brought up more questions, which are all, good to think about and ask, but just, further complicates the whole effort.
Thank you, Chris, but we ran out of time also, so.
I would just add, as Chris said, underscore that like best practices that we are, really looking for, plus like a little bit more information would really help.
Yep, and I would just say again, to reiterate, please let us know what specifically information you'd like. I see that we have some of those items in the chat, but also after the meeting, make sure you get that information to us so that we can provide information during the week that you can have as you move into support again next week. Along, we'll get to Team Hoffman and Shanice.
So similarly, our group didn't get to finish our activity. So what I'm going to do is also share my screen and maybe invite Seth or Beth or another member of our group to talk about what we shared. But 7, 8, and the 9th scenario, or feeder path, seems like a focus, and we talked a little bit about Woodstock and Harrison Park's impacts. But Seth or Beth or another member would to chime in.
I'll let someone else do it because I tend to talk to.
Or Josh.
I don't know that we, landed on anything hard enough for me to speak to, right? Like, every scenario leads to more questions, and every one of them is self-defeating by the end. And so I think getting more data, looking through the demographics, and spending more time with the data we just got will help.
Thank you. Team Holgate, Esther.
Oh, hello. So we started up looking at 3 scenarios, 4, 7, and 9, but we spent the bulk of our time on scenario 9. And I am going to call Miss Marissa. Miss Marissa, would you please share the rich conversations you had?
Yes, sorry, I'm meeting. Okay, so we have representatives in our group from Harrison Park and Marysville. So we felt like we could only really start from the communities that we are familiar with and, know the interests of and needs of the neighborhood. And so we started there and said, well, these are the items that we feel are really non-negotiable to our communities, which number 1 would be a neighborhood K-5 school within the neighborhood boundary of Harrison Park. And so that would be at the Clark campus. And we did not reach the point of proposing any alternate location for creative science school, unfortunately. But we also came to the conclusion that it makes the most sense to us to continue to have 2 strands of neighborhood and 1 Mandarin DLI strand for K-5 at Clark and within the current Harrison Park boundary. We also feel like we had this kind of overarching idea of balancing demographics by thinking of middle school feeders in east to west view rather than north to south, based on changing socioeconomic and racial demographics as we move further east in the city. So we thought scenario 9 like most closely started where we wanted to start, except for not really proposing a neighborhood not really proposing a K through 5 to feed Harrison Park, but we do like Vestal and Glencoe feeding to Mount Tabor and Madison. Geographically, that makes a lot of sense to us, and also kind of balancing demographics at Mount Tabor and Madison enrollment numbers. Then we like the Clark K through 5, and like I was talking about, the east to west kind of boundary. Clark, Bridger, and Atkinson feeding to Harrison Park Middle School. Arleta, Marysville, and Lent feeding to Kellogg Middle School. We feel like it's not really within our scope to determine the needs of the Lent community around DLI, but we just, as in the interest of saying this is not like a decision that we feel we can make, we said let's go with the springboard proposal of having Lent be all Spanish DLI, and then Bridger and Atkinson being neighborhood school. Bridger and Atkinson being neighborhood programs. So then Spanish DLI feeds to Kellogg. Then we thought that one change that again is not really like within the scope of our view of our knowledge to decide ultimately, but we feel like there are options with lane feeders, but we thought it might make sense to have, geographically to have Woodstock feed to Lane along with Woodmere and Kelly, and then to Franklin, and then have the Mandarin DLI programs join together at Franklin. Then in order to balance enrollment in the high schools, to have Sunnyside go to Cleveland, and I think that's it. Anything else to add? We also did not address Richmond.
I'd just like to add, Marissa, that was great. We talked about like the actual school boundaries themselves, looking at further later about straightening them out, and just being from Marysville, having the Foster boundary for Marysville change to Foster is probably not good for the socioeconomic demographics of our school, unfortunately, based on the housing types north of Foster versus south of Foster. I think it would really divide the neighbors and make school possibly harder for some community members.
All right, thank you. Last group, Team Powell, Kristen.
So our group spent a lot of time in discussion, so we didn't get very far into the scenarios. I think very similar to a lot of groups. We definitely wanted more information about DLI kind of in one spot. I think we were having a hard time navigating all the different places that information was available and trying to conceptualize what was present on the slides and then bringing in other information that was available in different places. There was also some discussion about using information that's available in this book, as well as information from the Successful Schools Survey and narratives from schools about what schools hope for. Eventually, we decided that scenario 4 was one that seemed like a good one to move forward with. We didn't get a chance to move very far into discussing it, but folks liked the fact that there was balancing of the high schools and reduction of the over-enrollment at Franklin, a higher enrollment at Madison, and then grouping of Spanish DLI schools together. And I invite anybody else who wants to jump in from my group with something that I may have missed to share.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we were also asking about is information that was missing about DLI programs, and also information about ISC programs, which is programs for students with disabilities that we don't have information, but are focus programs that are also affected by the change within all those boundaries. Then as well, we were made aware of a report that came out in 2016 and it was presented to the school board that another coalition group created. It's 3 years old, it's a little bit old, but it also stated that the main finding from this group stated that if any changes were going to be made to the Southeast coalition, that the highest group affected and that needed to be prioritized were DLI programs and ISC programs, as they were going to be the most highly affected. So I feel we went with scenario 4 because of balance things at the high school level, but I don't know if it necessarily is an equitable choice, I think.
And that report was from Multiple Pathways to Graduation, I think. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you. Great work tonight. Like I said earlier, we realize this takes time and it's going to take more time in the environment we're in. And so as we wrap up tonight, I just want to make sure that you understand that we are going to take next week to continue this work and allow you to really flesh out a scenario to by the end of the next meeting. And so if you didn't get a chance to look at all of the scenarios brought forward, certainly listen to the conversation that happened tonight and take a look at some of those other ones that maybe were presented that other groups really liked, so that you can bring that information back to your group to really start putting some specifics behind your group's scenario that you'd like to complete and see modeled for the following week's meeting. So if there's more information that needs to be, that you need in order to do that well, please reach out to us and we'll work this week to get all the information that you need to be able to continue this work and feel confident with the work. This time I'd like to turn it over to Esther on the evening tonight and to take us out.
All right. I do want to seize this opportunity to thank everybody for participating in these groups. The discussions tonight were so much richer and so much more focused. Thank you to Flow Analytics for creating those scenarios. That said, I do want you to also please take time to give us your feedback. There is a link in one of the slides for our community feedback. We also do want you to give us feedback on the meeting itself. It's been great working with you. We look forward to meeting with you next week. We thank you again for your continued collaboration and your willingness to participate. Please continue to think about the scenarios. The more we think about them, the more in depth we get, the more ideas are generated, and the more we're able to share. So that at the end of the day, even if we all don't get what we want, we at least will get something that we're proud of that centers our students and our values of PPS. Have a great night, a safe travel home, and we will see you next week.